Alrighty, everyone! This is the big one. Welcome to the Roads to the Porterverse episode, centered around the one and only Northwestern Railway. This railway's history is excruciatingly long. Let's be honest. And disclaimer as always for these videos, this is not official lore in any regard at all. Some stuff may be similar, some stuff may be different. It's all intentional. It is all purely headcanon, aka made up. So if you agree or disagree with any stuff in here, it is perfectly fine. And if you want to use any elements from my headcanon videos, go ahead. And also if you want to make your own sort of videos in the style of this series or my other series, go nuts. Completely fine. Anyway, so this is part 1 of the Northwestern Railway and Railroads of the Porterverse. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. It all begins on a little island off the coast of England. As of 1921, there were 2 standing railways on the island of Sodor. The Titmus, Wellsworth, and Brendam Light Railway, and the Sodor and Mainland Railway. Then they were occupying the east and west region respectively. In 1921, the Railways Act was passed, and thus the hundreds of railway systems in the United Kingdom at the time were grouped into larger ones. These were the LNER, LMS, GWR, and SR. The railways of Sodor were excluded from the Act, as the awkward placement between the certain regions was overlooked by Parliament. It basically left the current Big Four railways to determine what to happen with Sodor's railways. It was also during this time that the people of central Sodor, so around like Kilden area, were demanding rail access. This led to the 2 railways on Sodor agreeing to a merger which doubled the defense mechanism to prevent buyout. Thus, the 2 railways at the time merged, and that created the Northwestern Railway. But the fight was still on, as the LMS was growing pretty eager to buy out the then struggling Northwestern Railway. The LNER, the big competitor of the LMS, sought to prevent their competitor from expanding, but they also didn't have interest in buying either. They instead sold the struggling Northwestern Railway 2 of their brand new A1 Pacific locomotives. They will be the primary engines that will build the main line alongside Thomas and Edward. The main line will be fully completed by early 1923. With this, express services were opened, and the railway began to thrive finally. The NWR thrived so much that the Big Four conceded and let the Northwestern Railway remain independent. The NWR was now one of the Big 5 railways of Britain, and thus a new golden age began. With the grand opening of the Northwestern Railway, some other engines were shuffled around and were given new designations. A few one-off engines were also built as well. The terminus of the railway was also changed to become Knapford, as all the services started there. In mid-1923, Henry broke down a tunnel. The director of the time, Sir Fergus Wegaby, never liked Henry and had him break up in a tunnel in a fit of rage after learning about his breakdown. A new whole tunnel was bored just to bypass Henry, even though it could have been moved. And this whole incident outraged the entire working community of the railway and made headlines. The government would have to step in and ultimately remove Wegaby from power. Fergus Wegaby was replaced by a young Sir Tom Hat I, who reopened the tunnel immediately after. In 1924, the first engine of what was going to be a new NWR steam engine class entered service. The 260 mogul known as James was indeed his engine, but he had a slight design fault. His brake blocks were wooden, and thus caught fire during his trials. He actually derailed on one of these goods trials near Crosby. Thankfully, Thomas was able to clear the mess immediately, and in his reward for acting quickly, he received 2 of his own coaches for his exclusive use. James re-entered service shortly afterwards, with the faults corrected. The incident would still discourage the railway from building more of his class, and thus James was now a one-off engine. In 1925, Thomas and Brodie raced on the Little Branch Line. This was kept under wraps for a good while, as there was a fear of being fined for various reasons, like speeding and stuff like that. In the same year, in the winter, Thomas crashed into a snow pile, which resulted in the newly built tractor known as Terrence rescuing him. Thomas and Terrence would become good friends after this. In February 1926, most of the big engines, led by Gordon, Henry, and James, all went on strike. They demanded that a shunter be designated exclusively to Knapford Station, as the engine was usually Thomas and he was no longer able to do it at all anymore. Tom had the NWR's locomotive works above an 040 saddle tank known as Percy, just for this occasion. During and after Percy's destruction, a batch of engines which included Thomas, Molly, Edward, and Percy took on the work of the big engines until they returned to service in June of 1926, and that was when the strike ended. In 1928, Edward was finally designated as the primary runner of the Brenham branch line. In 1929, the effects of the recession began to take hold. The second A1, known as Jade, who was number 27, was sold back to the LNER, while Gordon stayed. And in 1930, engines 98462 and 87546 were sold alongside engine Red Dragon in order to keep the railway afloat. The locomotive roster of the railway was very slim at this time. In 1931, wanting to avoid selling another one of his engines, Sir Tom I had large amounts of Welsh coal purchased for use for Henry, as a means of countering the design faults. This would last until around January 1935, when Henry collided with a goods train near Kildare. The railway will carry out a complete overhaul of Henry, which saw him out of action for the rest of the year. Other engines like Molly and James will pick up the goods work slack. Henry will return to service in early 1936 with a new firebox design which greatly improved its performance. In 1937, Henry was mistakenly repainted with glowing green paint, and by nightfall, half the island was convinced he was another ghost that was terrorizing the railway. He will be repainted by 1938, of course. 1938 also saw the China Clay Pits south of Brenham open, and Bill and Ben would arrive to run it. In 1939, the Ironworks would open in Peel Godred. In that same year, Bakerstown Station was completely renovated. The old station was completely demolished and was rebuilt with a massive canopy station with a whopping 7 platforms. This was done as there was also a junction with the other railways on the mainland. That had that room for the space, you know? And with this, we have finally covered part 1 of the history, spanning from 1921 to 1939. In part 2, we will be kicking off in 1939 as well, and we'll be going a decent ways up, basically during the entire British Railways era. And then in part 3, we'll be covering the post-British Railways era. Thank you all very much for watching this episode of Railways of the Porterverse, and I shall see you all in the next one.